I am so excited for this session, and I hope you are too. Andrew, I have been a follower of Andrew Seaman on LinkedIn for a while, and then I went to a school event in New York City where Andrew lives, and there I saw Andrew up on stage, and it was at Columbia, and he's chairman of the board of the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. So we share that, and it was so great to see you. So Andrew, thank you so very much for joining today, for being with us.
Of course. No, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So a little bit about Andrew, but Andrew, we got so much to get to. I mean, there's so many things happening, not only at LinkedIn and the kind of the workforce, but also for older workers, or as we say, experienced workers. But so you're editor at large for jobs and careers at LinkedIn. You've been there, just so everybody knows, about 8 years. Prior to that, you held positions at Reuters and USA Today. So you were a seasoned journalist. But I'd love to understand, maybe you could share a little bit about all the things that your role at LinkedIn, because I know you do a lot of things.
Yes. And again, thank you for having me. I always like talking about, you know, topics, especially when we can drill down a little bit into areas of the workforce. And yeah, so basically, I started at LinkedIn a little over 8 years ago after 8 years at Reuters and a smattering of contract roles at other places. But basically, at LinkedIn, I started on what's called the daily news team. So LinkedIn has about 200 journalists around the world who, do local coverage, local curation, things like that. And what happened is basically LinkedIn found that it was very valuable to bring in professional journalists to cultivate really good conversations. And I was very fortunate to kind of join early. And for some reason, they didn't really do anything for job searching or careers, and I thought that was very weird. So I went to a meeting one time, and I just said, "What if I do a newsletter for job seekers?" And it was sort of like, "Yeah, you could try it." And after a year, it turned into my full time job. So it's fun being here. It's a different beast being in a tech company than a traditional media company, but I really enjoy it because I get to do kind of what's called service journalism. So the way I always describe what I do here is I do the non-marketing side of LinkedIn. So like I don't concern myself too much with like how the platform works, things like that. It's mostly how can I help people sort of move forward in their job search or career. And my ethos has always been, it's important to read what the current unemployment rate is or the hiring rate. But for the average person, that doesn't mean much. So, how can we give them the tools to take action based on data or the latest information? So that's sort of how I approach my work. And I had a podcast. I do live shows for LinkedIn, and I do a lot of stuff behind the scenes. So
Well, I think
that's
you're
kind of the
being
world I operate in.
Yeah, I think you're being a little bit too modest. You oversee the Get Hired franchise of products and services, that whole ecosystem at LinkedIn. For those of us who know, LinkedIn, 2 billion, nearly 2 billion users, the largest professional network in the world. And you have 1.2 million subscribers to your newsletter. And I know with Aaron's help, and maybe Doug will probably list in the chat a link to your newsletter so people can, Encore
Thank you.
members can subscribe. I spent this morning going through, and there's just so much there that you've covered. So really wanted to kind of make sure we have time to go into
Thank
that.
you.
But maybe we can start big picture. So you mentioned job reports. We're always kind of flooded with these numbers. We don't know what to trust. There's so many changes and trends happening in the jobs or careers area. Are there some big kind of mega trends or shifts that you're tracking yourself that we should know about?
Yes. So I think right now the we know it's a tough market out there. And there's a lot of different pieces that I've been paying attention to and also trying to keep things in context. I think the most important thing to know is that we're still coming off of a time of really intense hiring. So after the pandemic, there was this hiring spree that really I don't think there was a good comparison in modern times. It was sort of like every company in the world just said like, hey, let's just hire as many people as we can. Um, so now we're in that time where they're sort of right sizing their workforces still. They're not bringing on new people. And comparatively, people who maybe had job searched, let's say 4 years ago, are saying, wow, this is a really different market. So on a lot of fronts, it feels probably worse than it is. We are seeing that hiring is down, even compared to pre-pandemic. So it is a tough market, but I think coming off of that really weird period after the pandemic is still making people feel probably worse than they would have if we just had more of a smooth ride. The other thing, obviously, is AI. Obviously, I don't think that is too much of a surprise. I think what we're seeing in our data and what I'm hearing from our data scientist and economist, I'll get my words right someday. But essentially, AI right now, we don't see it affecting the workforce in terms of job reductions yet. There are obviously people who are getting laid off, and there are companies here or there that are laying people off, but I don't think from what I've been told, it's not because of AI. It's mostly other macroeconomic factors. And I think AI is kind of an easy scapegoat for companies because instead of saying like, "Hey, we're not going to see a lot of growth," they could say AI, and it looks like, "Hey, we're going to do efficiency stuff," and it becomes more attractive to investors or their board. But so AI, I'm keeping an eye on, but I'm more cautiously optimistic of just seeing how that's growing and what companies are doing with that. But yeah, I think that's it. And then also how they're going to start hiring around the idea of AI. So I think actually, especially for this group, I think people who have more experience in the labor market, their worth in to employers is increasing. And I think what we're seeing is that people who are early in their careers, they're struggling a little bit more because companies, I think we see, are gravitating toward people who have proven judgment or critical thinking skills. And I think those are the things that you really acquire over time. So I think that's why we're starting to see Gen Zers and people early in their career exceed other generations when it comes to long-term unemployment. So there's a lot of things happening. So I try to keep it all in perspective, but those are three of the things that I'm looking at now.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. And you mentioned obviously, Encore is an organization that is focused on removing barriers for experienced workers. And as you know, that segment is forecasted to be really the biggest driver of growth of into the U.S. labor market in the next 10 to 15 years. You talked about AI, and you have such an interesting insight of people. It seems like, as you said, the younger generation or the 25 to 44 sees it as fatalistic and is turned off by it. But is the more experienced worker looking at it differently? Are they more enthusiastic? Have you done any studies or kind of seen any insights on that?
Yes, we have actually. So last year we launched what was called the AI Confidence Index. And so we have a workforce confidence index, which is just like, we ask people, how do you feel about your odds of getting a job or getting promoted, things like that. So we sort of did the same thing with AI. Is AI going to help you in your career? Are you optimistic about AI's influence, in the workforce, those sort of things? And it came back and it I wasn't so much surprised at how the generations embraced it. I was surprised how younger generations were really turning away from it. So when it came to the generations who were embracing it and said, hey, I think this might actually help, Gen X was top, and then it came to baby boomers, and then it was millennials, and then Gen Z was way down there. In fact, the Gen Zers were so pessimistic about AI that the first few data pools that we did, so we do a lot of the surveys in waves, so it's not like we do one and that's it. We do, one wave, a couple waves. And the first couple of waves, the data scientists were like, oh, we think this is a fluke. We think there's something wrong with the data. And then it kept coming back because essentially triggered their alarm or triggered their like suspicion was that it sent the confidence to negative. And we had never seen one of our confidence indexes go negative. So they were all thinking, well, it's just wrong. But it kept coming back the same. So um, when you look at actually like the Gen Xers and baby boomers, I think part of it is, and obviously we don't know the actual reason because we can't poll everyone, but I think part of it is people realize like, they're going to have to be in the workforce for a while, like, and the workforce is getting more dynamic. So I think people are just more game to experiment, whereas people who are just starting out, I think they're entering a world that few people are prepared for and few people are prepared for at that stage. And then the other aspect, I think, I grew up in north of Scranton in Pennsylvania, and right now there's a huge backlash against data centers. So what I'm hearing from a lot of, my friends who are college professors is that their students are really concerned about the environmental aspect. So I think that's also weighing on that end of the spectrum. So yeah, when it comes to 45 plus, 50 plus, we're actually seeing them really excited about AI and kind of jumping into the seat and saying, "Hey, we're going to learn this." So even our LinkedIn Learning data show that as AI came on the scene, there was a technical skill gap between the youngest workers and the oldest workers, and that's closed significantly. So I would say that the people who've been in the workforce for a while are really going to are kind of saying like, "Hey, we want to learn this."
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm here actually in a hotel room in Washington D.C. for the Jobs of the Future conference, Horizons, and your chief economic officer, I forget his name, who wrote the book.
Oh, Anish.
Yeah, he was here and he talked
Yeah.
about AI and talked about people with management skills working with AI equals success. So kind of like what you're saying is that to really get the most of AI in terms of whatever application, in terms of how you're using it in your own company and whatever company it is, they're seeing this desire to have somebody who's maybe has a little bit more experience, can handle things, and to really kind of manage AI and optimize it.
Yeah, and the thing that I always tell people is that AI, even though I think we're all sick and tired of hearing about it, like it's still in the early days, and it's going to be messy for a while. Because I think a lot of researchers, and I've read a lot of the stories about, which professions will be affected first and how they'll be effective. The one variable that we can never account for is what some CEO is going to do. So, like, even if we say, like, okay, in 2028, all marketing roles can be automated by AI, you don't know if there's going to be a CEO who says in the end of this year, you know what, let's try it anyway. So like that's I think where the messiness comes from, and also I think we're in the part now, and we're seeing the headlines of companies who invested heavily in AI, and now I don't know. I kind of think of it as buyer's remorse, where they say like, maybe we shouldn't have gone all in because the tokens and all of this are getting more expensive and we've sort of exhausted our budget. And what I sort of have been talking to a few people about is, you know, is there this buyer's remorse where they would have rather put some of their budget into humans instead of AI? Because AI, once the tokens run out, it's done. Whereas if you continue to invest in humans, like the human's going to keep working no matter what, as long as you give them their paycheck. So we're in this really messy middle, and so I think, yeah, management roles I think are safe, but I think we will see some people who in like the middle management area probably get laid off and stuff until companies realize, oh wait, we still need them. So
Right. Yeah. One of the things that you do a great job in your series and podcast before, but also in the newsletters, is LinkedIn is such a large ecosystem and it can be confusing and sometimes kind of a little overwhelming, in terms of how to navigate it, how to position yourself, especially for, as you said, experienced workers, fighting ageism instances and things like that. Would love to kind of get your advice or some things that you kind of would impart to us about how to best, what kind of things should we be thinking about to position ourselves in LinkedIn as we maybe re-enter the workforce or, continue on and get new gigs?
Yeah. So I think like there's something that even like as I got older and like, I've been in the workforce now for like 20 plus years at this point, but what I've noticed is that you have this drive or urge to sort of position yourself as like, listen, I've climbed the ladder, I've done all this stuff, and you kind of get these airs about you. And one thing I always tell people is like, you really need to sort of say, listen, a team player. Even if I've been, a senior director or something like that, I want to work with people. I want to get in there. I want to learn new things. And that's, I think, applicable to anyone who's like 35 plus, honestly, because it's just that idea of like, listen, I've been here for a while. Don't make me go through these hoops again. And I don't think you have to go through those hoops. I think it can just be off putting when people sort of feel that that's your sort of vibe. So I just always tell people to really show that, listen, I want to be a team player. I want to work with people. And then the other thing is, I think, it's not easy to sort of figure out how to exist in this new market. So like what I often tell people is like, the way I learned to job search was in my 10th grade business class. And that was in the early 2000s. And my teacher at that point, she was 75. I don't know when she was taught how to job search. So we're all sort of taught from these old days that don't exist anymore. So part of it is just saying, like, listen, I have this experience and I want to use it for you. And I think bringing that to the forefront of saying, like, okay, this is how I can apply it. And I think that's the story you want to tell on your LinkedIn profile. So if it's your about section, if it's your experience section, take time to go through them and say, okay, yes, I increased sales X%, or I landed the biggest deal in my company's history. But talk a little bit about how you did that and sort of how you would apply it in today's day. And then also just showing that you've adapted before. So, like, one thing I often say is like when I started at Reuters, we were using a DOS system. And today, when I talk to like some of our recent hires who are just fresh out of college, they have no idea what DOS is. And I was like, listen, I'm like, that was what computers were. And so I think like showing that like, hey, listen, I've managed our transition from DOS content management system to a new enterprise system that was bespoke or something like that. It's really about sort of crafting your narrative and not hiding your experience, but showing how it's of value. And I think especially the one thing I would say is a lot of people, I think, even 5 years ago would say like if they're changing careers or they're looking outside of their traditional industry, they would hide their experience as like, ooh, don't look under this curtain because that was then. I'm looking for new things. But I think companies and employers have embraced the idea of diversification. So show how your experience is a value add to them. And yeah, so I know that it's not the perfect answer, but it really comes down to storytelling of like, I'm a team player and I want to use my experience to help you.
Right. And can you talk about, and there was a few people comments in the chat area, but as you said in the old days, or with technology and job boards, you would apply for a position, you hit send, you include your resume or your CV through the LinkedIn, through the automated link, and you kind of think, oh, I applied for it.
Yeah.
And you've done a lot of interesting columns about the need for networking, the art of networking. Can you talk a little bit about how networking is really replacing or should be top of mind for us rather than just hitting the apply button?
Yeah. And I think in this respect, it's another place where people who are like 45 plus have a really strong system or, support system because LinkedIn did this study with AARP at the end of last year. And I think it was published actually sometime this year, but the work was actually done toward the end of last year. And basically, it found that people who were like 50 plus had gigantic networks, um, and much more than other age groups. The question was how often they were actually sort of keeping them active and reaching out. So the way I often talk about job searching, and I know a lot of the influencers who are out there who, you'll see them on Facebook or Instagram, or I don't use TikTok, but I'm sure they're there too, where they say this is the one thing you have to do to get a job. And I always tell them, and a lot of them know this, is that there is no one thing that you can do to get a job. And also, I think this is one of the things that LinkedIn, as an ecosystem, I think it tackles well, but I don't think the messaging is there, where basically, people who you could use your networking on LinkedIn, you could apply on LinkedIn, you can post content and all of that. And I think it honestly takes just a little bit of everything. I call it like a holistic approach. And that is going to increase your chances. And, a lot of it is just reaching out to people and say, hey, this is what I'm looking for, or this is what I'm after. And even our own research shows what are called like weak ties. So, not necessarily your best friend or the person who hired you a few years ago, but the people who maybe you worked with 10 years ago or 15 years ago. They're the ones who are going to find those opportunities for you and think of you when something crosses their desk. So, I think networking still is sort of the most powerful fuel in the job search. It's definitely it's one tool of many, but I think it's the thing that will move you forward the most. And I don't think I don't think it's difficult to kind of keep your connections warm. So like one thing I do is I'm terrible with names and faces, but I'm really good at remembering like quirky things about people. So what I'll do is like when I see something in the news that reminds me of someone or something that they're interested in, that's when I reach out and I'll say like, "Hey, I thought of you." And I think that takes it to a different place of just like, "Hey, I'm looking to connect for just generic reasons." It's, "Hey, I actually thought of you just randomly." So things like that I think go a long way.
So that's good to know. So even though I might not have been kind of like in a full-time gig for 5 or 6 years or 7 years, you still think that kind of it's worthwhile reconnecting and, as you say, trying to relate to people on these quirky things and
Yeah.
these weak ties, and that can actually bring a lot of value, success for you.
Yes. And the one thing I would always caution, and I always caution this, is don't ask for a job. Because I always tell people, like, just think of like the other person, especially if you're reconnecting after several years. It's going to take a little while to warm up that relationship. And you don't want someone just reaching out after like 6 years and saying, like, hey, do you got a job for me? I think we may have all been on the receiving end of those messages, and you always feel a little bit used. So, you always have to put in the work.
Right. Now, are there fractional roles, is a term that has really only become very popular in the last 5 to 10 years, perhaps. Before that was seen as being a consultant or
Yeah.
a contractor. Have you seen those kinds of pick up an interest for those kinds of things, or more companies kind of classifying their role as a fractional, or is it still, what are you seeing in that area?
I think it's a mixed bag right now. Like we're seeing a lot of people move into like a consulting role, or consulting roles, or they're creating their own sort of consulting company and they're calling themselves founders. Whether companies are moving closer to that as just like an operating model, I think remains to be seen. I think it's still a really good place to be, especially if you're in between full-time roles or, you still want flexibility. And I think also it gives you a chance to flex across different companies, different industries, and roles. So I think it's still very attractive and it's a good place to be. I just don't know where companies are heading. And the reason I say that is because with AI and companies investing more, I don't know if maybe the trend will move toward them saying like we want to rely more on full-time people or we want to rely more on contractors. But there's still a big market out there, especially in the tech industry, because the tech industry I think is in a very weird place right now. So yeah, so right now it's great. I just don't know if companies are going to like keep embracing that or if they're going to change their approach.
Yeah, it's interesting. Solopreneurship, as you mentioned, is a obviously a growing trend in the
Yeah.
workforce. And it seems like the over 55 set are a real driver of that, as you mentioned. Um, and when LinkedIn looks across those kinds of things, is that a focus area, or maybe you can talk a little bit about LinkedIn in terms of, are they focusing on certain groups or developing programs for certain groups or
Yeah.
segment?
So I know that solopreneurs, I don't know. It in my mind, I just lump like entrepreneurs, solopreneurs together. If you talk to some people who use those titles, they get very specific about what it is. Um, Entrepreneurs, I think, have always been sort of that engine of economic sort of creation and ideation. Solopreneurs, I think, is taking on a new idea in the age of AI, because essentially what that is that people are gravitating toward is saying, like, listen, I don't have to start a business and hire 20 people. I can start a business and mostly do it myself with the help of AI. So I think that is something that I'm hearing a lot internally about, just because we're seeing people who are building businesses and large businesses, and it's just like maybe them and one other person plus AI. But entrepreneurs have always sort of been a big part of what we do. So, every year we put out what's called the top startup list. And, a lot of those are sort of small entrepreneurial ventures, because we want to shine a light on those. And then we also have like a top companies list, which are more established businesses. But yeah, solopreneurs, I just say are big ones. We've been really focused on sports recently, which is interesting, and mostly because I think a lot of athletes, we pay them quite a bit of money in terms of as society. So you have these people who, they retire at 35 or 40 and they have many millions in the bank. So they're looking to invest in different companies. So that's been something that's been really interesting to watch sort of take hold on
Well, it's interesting
LinkedIn.
because our membership, we have a lot of professional athletes who are very wealthy. No, I'm kidding.
Well, that's good. You should all be on LinkedIn then. And then what is it? Yeah, so that's obviously a big area. And then we try and give people in different age brackets sort of what they need. Because I think, as there are the general sort of overview of what job searching and career is, but the actual advice to get you to the next level or get you to your next opportunity will look a little bit differently, depending on where you are in your career.
Yeah,
So we try and sort of focus differently for those different age groups.
right. You mentioned ageism, and we've had a few comments about ageism. And I think you did a kind of one of your newsletters. You talked about AI and whether that was, kind of taking some people out of the pipeline or
Yeah.
screening. Is there anything that you can share to talk about where ageism is, or is it on the rise, or is it now, as we've talked about, maybe lessening, or anything you can share
Yeah.
insights on
So I think this is it's definitely a tricky question, because I think we're in the process of companies lessening the obstacles that they've sort of systemically put in place for people who have been in the workforce for a while. Um, and I'm somewhat of a cynic. This is going to sound terrible, but like it's always good to do things altruistically, to like, hey, we should just be doing this because it's just the right thing to do. But I've always believed that when it comes to sort of addressing systemic discrimination, like a business is a business, so you always have to make the business case. So all of the signs right now, I think, are pointing toward a direction where ageism for older workers it's going to lessen. And I think we're going to see bigger barriers now for people on the other end of the spectrum. So Gen Zers, people early in their careers. And the reason I say that is because we've seen a lot of companies say like, hey, we want people with more experience who can sort of do that critical thinking and judgment like we talked about earlier. um, and people who are just fresh out of college or just joining the workforce, they don't necessarily have that, not yet. And then the other thing too is that one thing that I come back to a lot is the one time I interviewed a surgeon, and I think it was in Duke. It's been many years, but I remember talking to him, and I was interviewing him, and I said, I'm sorry to take up your time. And he goes, oh, no, 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 no. He goes, it's fine. He says, they brought me back from retirement because he said all the younger surgeons were trained on robots. And he said, but sometimes you need to go into and do more complicated surgeries. So I think there's been more recognition of that. And then also, I put in the chat the AARP link. Hiring workers who they've raised a family, or they're more settled in their lives in general, for a business standpoint, they are less absent during the work week. They are more likely to stay at the company. So basically, like, if you have to put your finger up in the air and sort of say like which way is the wind blowing, I think it's pointing toward sort of older workers getting an easier foothold. But I think it's difficult to know what that's going to look like because the data right now, I think, is a little bit messy. What you were talking about earlier is applicant tracking systems. So, applicant tracking systems, it's something that when I first started this, I think I believe what most people do, which is that applicant tracking systems essentially, they're the ones who decide who moves forward in the process and who doesn't. After spending most of my time here, doing this for the better part of 7 years. So I've been at LinkedIn 8 years, but I've been doing this full time 7 years. Applicant tracking systems are kind of like just stupid computer systems. They're getting better, but essentially they are kind of just big Excel spreadsheets with like a fancier front to them. And they are getting more complicated now because of AI, but I think people give them too much credit. And also, there are people who make a really good living selling applicant tracking system resumes or things like that. So, when people say, well, like, why are all these tools out there? I'm like, people can make money by putting those tools out there. So, of course. So I often tell people, don't worry about that. Worry about creating a really good resume and a really good sort of approach to your job search. And don't worry about this weird computer system. What we are seeing now, and I think there's been some headlines recently about HireVue and those places. They're getting into trouble because they're kind of pushing the envelope of like what the hiring systems can do. So HireVue has been like this big messy thing in the news that I'm not too familiar with. But then there was something recently from Stanford that I was seeing kind of all over about the Stanford study that showed that these hiring systems were discriminating against other people, specifically people who are Asian and Black, and not like insignificantly. Like this was pretty significant discrimination, and it was a working paper, so there wasn't a lot to go off of just reading it. But then I talked to the author, and essentially what it was one system, and it was a very weird system. The system, you played games. It was called Pymetrics, and it was acquired eventually. But I have actually used the system because I try and, like, if I can experiment with like new stuff, I will. And essentially you would play like a game of like risk, like how much money will you gamble, and then it would try and say whether you're a good fit for the role. And so everyone took these findings and said, well, all of hiring is a scam. It was only this one system, which was a very unique, not used often system. So I think that created a lot of concern recently. And I think it is cause for concern because, these companies that do this, they don't give their data to people to freely evaluate. So we kind of have to take their word for it that they're unbiased and they're not screening out. But right now, we don't have any evidence to say that like there's ageism built into things. I think they pop up periodically, but unless companies who create these systems start to um, give their data for evaluation, it'll be hard to know. And also, I always like to tell people LinkedIn is not an applicant tracking system. Like, when you apply, some of that information will go into an applicant tracking system, but we're not an applicant tracking system.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good to know. Well, I mean, one of the big things happening and was is here at this conference, Jobs for the Future in DC that everyone is talking about, and SHRM, is skills versus degrees, and skills assessments. So employers worrying more about whether you have the skill to do something as opposed to did you go to do you have a BA or a
Yeah.
master's, or even if you've, kind of how old you are. So do you see that continuing? And then if that's the case, if I might not have been in the workforce for a few years, or, at a real company, but I have great skills, how would I like get that to the top? How would I emphasize that across LinkedIn? What would be your advice?
Yes. So the first thing I think is that yes, I think skills are going to kind of be the key to the future of the workforce. Um, and I don't say that just to be dramatic or because Anish and our former CEO really, globbed onto that idea. But when AI was coming on, we did openly talk about like, okay, how is this going to affect the workforce? And when people need to become more nimble, um, you need to be able to move, obviously, um, more freely. And you can't necessarily do that if you only constrict yourself to what your job title was or what your degree is in. But what you can do is say, listen, I have these skills. So I've always called it like a basket of skills. So you have like this big basket and you say, okay, yes, I'm an accountant, but what are all the skills that I use to do that job? Plus maybe other stuff I do. So maybe you are part of a community group and all that. There's nothing that says you can't bring that into that basket of skills and offer that as part of your job. And the idea is basically that you look at the skills you have and you forget your job title, you forget the degree, and you say, how can I configure these into something new? So actually, I'm doing a live, I think at one today, or no, two, sorry. But basically, like one of the things that I always suggest people do as an exercise, because I'm not big on like the star method or whatever. It's just like tell a good story. People remember stories. But I always say to draw like a Venn diagram of three circles. One is what are you good at? One is what interests you? And the other is where is their economic growth? And what you want to find is what's in the middle, like what's that sweet spot where there is like something that you're good at, something that you're interested in, and when there is demand. And that's usually a good place to sort of move toward. And it's not something that I think you have to be wedded to forever because we change, our careers change. So, but at as of this moment, like that's kind of a good place for you to go after. So that's kind of the exercise I suggest people do to figure out like how do I reconfigure this basket? And the reason I always say sort of pick those three areas you is in general, first of all, like you need to be good at something to get a job. Like not all the time. We've always had those coworkers who you're always like, how did they get this job? But you also have you want to have some interest in it. I'm a big believer like you don't have to love your job, but it shouldn't make you miserable. That's kind of my watchword. And then economic demand is the crucial part. That's what makes a job. Because if you have the skills and you have the interest, but there's no economic demand, you have a hobby. So like you want those three different pieces.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's interesting for you to talk about the skills because in LinkedIn there are a lot of areas format wise to emphasize and build out skills, as opposed to just listing where you've been in terms of your experience. So people, I guess, maybe spend a little bit more time on the skills area.
Yeah, and a lot of it is it takes work to figure out what your skills are, and I think to showcase that on your resume or LinkedIn profile, it really comes down to showing the results. So some people they put like a skills section up top or whatever on their resume, That's fine, but one big thing that I hear from employers is like that doesn't tell them how good you are at something. So like, I'm a very large man. So like I could say I'm a marathon runner. That doesn't mean I've ever finished one. Maybe, maybe I've run a block, but like that's sort of the way I think about it. So you really want to say like in your experience section, these are the results that I delivered because that's what I think the employers want to see. And especially now when like they're not doing a ton of hiring, they really want to see like, oh, this person can deliver and deliver quickly for us. And that's something that I do hear from like large employers. I think what more than anything, large employers would love like a database that like a skills wallet where everyone can say like, I have a 3.62 or whatever the score is in like customer service, but that doesn't exist. So the best that we have is like a resume or a LinkedIn profile that tells you the results that you delivered.
Can you talk a little bit about posting? And, posting is like everywhere, obviously. It's a big part of LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of pressure to post and be a thought leader. But it also is when you find an area or a company or even a place that you might want to volunteer at, it seems like it's the right thing to do or smart to kind of follow somebody who is a leader at that organization, their posts, and then compliment them or share things. Can you talk about that as a networking tool, kind of following people's posts and posting and commenting a little
Yeah.
bit?
And honestly, I think people they take it too far sometimes. Like they'll just comment on everything like someone posts, and they'll say like, "Wow, great" or something. But you really want to find, and this is why I think you want to find something that you're genuinely interested in because you do want to be that person who, if an article comes across your screen or you read it in the paper, you sort of genuinely want to read it, and that's sort of what I think it all comes down to is like if you read something really interesting, post about it, but don't just post it like the article and hope that people just take it from there. Add your own thoughts or your own interest. And I think this applies across the board. And one thing as a journalist, and Lem, you probably have realized this in the past, there is a publication for everything. So like one good example is like right now a lot of retailers double down on loss prevention because they have all those automatic checkout or whatever. So people steal a lot now. So there's magazines for like loss prevention or whatever. So like even if you're in that line of work, follow those trade magazines and say like, hey, in my experience, actually what works best is, whatever. And I think part of it is just flexing your muscles and your expertise to show this is not something that I'm just casually interested in or I see that there's a growth opportunity. This is something that I actually know and I'm interested in. And then, bring in people that maybe you've worked with before, or tag the author, or tag maybe the people who are mentioned in the story. Or, like you said, if you really want to work for a specific company, find people who work there and reach out and just say, like, hey, I really appreciate what you're sharing on LinkedIn, whatever. And, I look forward to following you and then interact with them. And that's sort of, I think, the secret sauce of networking. People usually don't like to hear this because they usually don't network until they really need a network. But I always think of it like cooking. It's like if you cook something really quick, you usually don't get a lot of good flavor out of it. But if you let something simmer, put it in the crock pot, it's going to come out really nice and juicy with a lot of good flavor. And that's sort of networking, is you want to give things time to percolate. You want it to really sit and sort of immerse itself. So again, I don't think you have to be a thought leader. I don't think you have to become an influencer, but I think just posting every once in a while about something that you find interesting and you show your professional interest and expertise, I think that could take you a long way.
And let me ask you, and that's great advice. And it's also fun, right? I mean, and as you said, folks with more experience have seen ups and downs and changes in industries and have insights that maybe, folks in different generations who are taking a leadership role for the first time would appreciate. Let me ask you, in terms of algorithms and things like that, or, for applying for things, if I'm a thought leader or if I'm posting a lot or commenting, does that have any effect on like where I show up and all that stuff?
No, I think the algorithm probably gives some preference to people who post regularly. Like, if you post like 3 times a week or something, it might say like, oh, this person does quality, and especially if people react to that. But it won't have any bearing on like your odds of getting hired or anything like that, like on the back end, other than, if you get wider distribution of your content, you have better chance of someone like, a star is born, like I pick you. But yeah, it's one of those things where people think a lot about LinkedIn's algorithm, and I've been here, a little over 8 years, and there are periodic meetings where it'll be like a myth busting thing with the team that does the algorithm. And honestly, most of the time I don't go, because my focus is, listen, I'm just putting out good content and I'm hoping it finds the audience. So like my big thing is like, I'm not the smartest or brightest bulb in the box, but if as long as I feel like I'm putting in good work, I'm hoping it's going to find the audience, and
Yeah.
I don't want to overthink things. So yeah, I think like regular consistency is good, but I don't think it's something that you have to really focus on in terms of like, where is this going? Is the algorithm treating me nicely?
Yeah, well, that's good. And throughout, thanks everybody for posting some questions in the chat. I've been monitoring them and trying to get to them. I know one of the questions was, and I don't know if you have information on this, Andrew, but LinkedIn, as a percentage of users or audience, do you track if it's one generation versus another generation? Meaning, typically, maybe LinkedIn was an early adoption, i.e., active
Yeah.
leadership kind of thing. And now that experienced workers are becoming more of the workforce, having a greater percentage, they should be using LinkedIn. Their participation and their share of LinkedIn should be more. Do you
Yeah.
track any of that, or do you see that more? Or?
I'm sure someone does. I personally don't really like. I know obviously that I think just intuitively a lot of LinkedIn's members are going to be more toward the established professionals, just because like they've been here a while. They've probably had to join LinkedIn at one point or another. Some of them probably like forgot that they joined LinkedIn. Like, I think Russell Crowe posted something once. He goes, "How did I get a LinkedIn profile?" or something like that. And um, but so I think in terms of members, but I'm not sure about like how active they are. I think Gen Z, because they're just sort of starting to dip their toes in the workforce, they're probably a smaller percentage of members, but I don't know about activity. And also something that is sometimes really difficult is to know people's age because of the different laws. So LinkedIn, the way it works is like, if Europe puts, and I'm using Europe just because they're usually the most extreme when it comes to like privacy laws. If they put in a law, we apply it across the company, just because it would, I think it would be impossible probably not to do that. So, but like, there's something called GDPR that's still in effect from Europe. And so like tracking certain data points is really difficult in terms of like, how old are you and things like that. So in general, it's difficult to even know, I think, how old a person is just in the system.
Yeah, do you think, and I know time wise, I want to turn it over to Doug for a little bit, but keeping my eye on the questions, there doesn't seem to be a lot of examples of employers who are shouting at their rooftops, to say we're employing older workers or experienced workers, or we have special programs. Do you see maybe that happening more in the future, where folks actually begin to plug that and to talk about that as a distinguishing factor as an employer? Because we don't have a lot of employer
Yeah.
stories with that yet.
I think so. It's, I think, a difficult area because the laws that exist. So one thing that, I talk to a lot of advocates for against age discrimination. And one thing that they're always, and a lot of them have come up, and they've probably kind of passed through the Encore network at some time. But what they always remind me is, when I'm talking to them, is that ageism applies across the board. So I think a lot of times, employers are hesitant to probably do those shouting from the rooftops because um, it could also say like, oh, then you're discriminating against people who are just entering the workforce. So I think that's a tricky situation. But there are programs that are in that a lot of bigger companies have. I Relaunch is this organization. I think they're based out of Cambridge, and they do what are called returnships. So if you've been out of the workforce for, let's say, I think there it's a minimum of 2 years, but what they do is they provide a list of places that where you can apply for essentially like an internship. And people do this maybe if they've taken time to be a caregiver, or maybe they've taken time to raise children or things like that. But it's not necessarily age based. It's just like how long have you been out of the workforce? So those are tend to be really popular, and the reason I think is because those companies have realized, oh, if we bring these people back who maybe have had that disruptive life event or something, they're going to stay with us for a while. They're going to show up to work every day. So I think those programs are what we see most often. But I think whenever it gets to anything to do with age, I think most companies are a little bit apprehensive because it's a very weird legal area. Because like what I often tell people is like, it's actually legal to ask someone their age during an interview. A lot of people go, that's completely illegal. What's illegal is using that information against them. So a lot of what you hear is, oh, well, it's illegal. No, it's just usually people won't ask that because they don't want to open that door. So like it's a really weird, thorny legal area.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's great. The resource that you gave.
Yeah.
Andrew, I know we've got so many questions and everything, but I urge folks to, I know we put the link in there and we'll put it again, but if you have, I don't know how many kind of newsletters, postings that you've done on AI and ageism and help, tricks of the trade and tips and things like that. So I urge folks to do that. And I know also that if I wanted to, I could schedule a personal session with you to help with what I'm trying to do. Do you still have that where you?
So I don't necessarily do that as part of LinkedIn. I do like coaching on the side,
Yeah, okay.
but yeah, I do I host a lot of things for LinkedIn premium members, and I have my other my archive of my podcast and things like that. So I don't usually, and I don't coach people on their LinkedIn just because I'd like to
Right.
stay employed and I don't want to get
Yeah.
in trouble.
Right. Yeah, no, 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 totally get it. Well, thanks so much. And I know you've been such a big advocate for breaking down barriers, whether it be age or, kind of affiliation or, everything for people to advance in their careers. So it's been a
Thank you.
wonderful session. And thank you so much for joining us. And I wanted, Doug, I know we want to kind of give everyone a preview of some of the other things that we've got going before we run out of time.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Andrew, so much for such good content. There was a question that came up. Someone asked about whether they could sign up for your 2 p.m. Podcast on communicating skills. Is that something?
Yes. So if you go to linkedin.com/events, you'll see it. It's with Catherine Fisher. We're doing 4, like one each week over the next month, kind of like building a job search process. So the one is today at 2 p.m. So if you go to linkedin.com/events, you'll see that. It's for LinkedIn Premium members, but I think you could get like a trial or stuff like that too.
Great, good. And we will, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be sending out a copy of the recording to everybody who signed up for today's event. And we'll also include the link to your Get Hired newsletter, Andrew. If there's anything else that you'd like to supply, we'll put in the AARP link as well. And anything
Thank
else
you.
we should include there, let Len and me know. And we'll be
Honestly, that sounds pretty good. And you could always find me at like linkedin.com/get hired. You could email me. It takes me some time to get through them, but I try and get to everyone within a week. So.
And I will say, Andrew, as you know, as a journalist, if you're looking for people who are doing innovative things in this segment, our membership, whether there's a whole movement on career coaching or doing certain things, at the local level, whether it's service or providing, kind of using their experience, please feel free to reach out. I know we'll have a lot of members who would be happy to share their stories or anything that they can as you continue to champion this across LinkedIn.
Thank you.
So there are two events coming up that I want to call your attention to before we adjourn. And that is next Tuesday, we have a coffee chat with Gillian Leithman on menopause and perimenopause, which turns out to be a big issue for women in the workforce, even as and it has continuing effects as they grow older as well. So take advantage of that opportunity. And at the end of the month, on July 30th, we're partnering with Encore Roadmap and a number of other organizations to look at age bias in the upcoming election. So it's a workshop to help people learn how to ask the right questions at the right time or the right candidates to continue to raise this issue and make sure that people who are running for office are thinking about age discrimination as a factor in the work they do in the policy-making field. So join us for those two events. You'll get more information in our newsletter for upcoming events, and stay tuned for other events coming up in the fall. Thanks for joining us today, and we hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.